Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a certainly a pleasure to be here today. I'm Wayne Spanner. I'm the managing partner of Norton Rose Fulbright in Australia, and it's certainly my pleasure to be here with such an esteemed group of speakers and authors, Professor Kerrie Sadiq, Dr. John Edwards, and Professor Stephen Martin, on the release of the CEDA report. The CEDA report, Australia's Business Summit Challenge, Securing G20's Future. Now, for the order of events today, we certainly do, as Stephen indicated earlier, want the participation of the group here with us today and also online. So if there are any questions, we do have some roving mics at the back of the room, which will find their way out in due course. And I would ask that when you do get the opportunity, please state your name, where you're from, and your question to our panel and or one of its members. Now, before we start, I thought, and while we give everybody the opportunity to think about some of their questions that they do want to pose, I thought there were a couple of things that stood out to me reading the reports and also through your presentations, and it stems, I suppose, from own personal experience in relation to being part of a global legal business, but it's the unique appreciation for the difficulty that the G20 faces with regard to influencing productive international policy and regulatory architecture. I think there's also the significant issue of the balancing that burden of regulation against the objective of a 2% GDP growth, I think is a delicate one that's going to require some innovative thinking from our world leaders. And I think I was also struck participating in the B20 a couple of weeks ago in Sydney by the level of confidence that business in fact has in the G20 group to be able to deliver the outcomes of which they are seeking, to be able to deliver the growth targets that are being set for which the G20 leaders and the government of Australia certainly set as part of the overall agenda. But before I go to any specific questions on the specific nature of the papers and the fantastic presentations that have been made today, I thought I'd take you up, I suppose, a level and just to set the scene of where we are. And I was interested in your thoughts, and they are very general thoughts, about what I could call the Putin effect. To what extent do you think the absence of Putin at the G20 or either his attendance at the G20 in Brisbane is something that could undermine or make it harder for the G20 to deliver on some results? Okay. Do you want to?
Well, why don't I kick off? I don't. The way I think about Putin's presence is this: that if Russia does invade the Ukraine to, protect its allies there, then I think it's pretty well impossible for Putin to come to the G20, particularly if it's occurring somewhat later in the year. It would just be too difficult to expect Putin to come and also European leaders to come in that circumstances if there was a firefight involving Russian troops in Ukraine. But short of that, I think he probably will be here. Shooting down a passenger plane, if you're not doing it deliberately, or in the Russian case, not actually doing it yourself, is not of itself a reason that you could credibly offer to refuse Putin, because obviously he didn't intend to, shoot it down. The Americans, of course, shot down an Iranian airliner. We were talking perhaps in the 80s. So I think Putin will be here unless the invasion occurs. But the key point I think you're making, Wayne, is would it make a difference? And I don't think it would, actually, because Russia is just not, doesn't have enough economic weight in the world. It's not involved in these major decisions of global financial reform, for example. So I don't think it would be missed in the same way, for example, Germany would be missed.
My view is that G20 is around economic issues, and there are other forums in the international architecture associated with security where issues associated with Russia, associated with the Ukraine, looking at ways to sort that problem out, in fact, can be pursued. Will Putin be here? Maybe. Does it matter if he's not? Probably not. At the end of the day, the other economies that are going to be here are going to be focused on economic issues. And perhaps his attendance might well be a bit of a sideshow that would give some an opportunity to grandstand around other matters, whereas in fact this is an economic forum. It is an economic forum. It's not a security forum. And if he's here, he should be coming to talk on economic issues here in Brisbane. And if he doesn't, who cares?
Just following on from both of those comments, from a tax perspective, we tend to talk about the BRICS together, but I think from a G20 perspective in relation to developing nations, we should be much more interested to hear what Brazil, India, China and South Africa are saying. They're actually the 4 of the 5 BRICS countries who are being quite proactive in terms of contributing to UN documents on tax avoidance, transfer pricing issues, and looking at various methodologies that think outside the box. So certainly from my perspective, I'm not looking much at what Russia is saying. It's the other 4 BRICS nations who could potentially make a significant difference.
Thanks for that, Kerrie. Just another quick question, then I'll come to the audience in a minute. There's a lot said in the report, particularly John, on sort of how effective can the G20 really be in good times, or is it only good in a crisis? Just interested in your thoughts also in relation to only good in a crisis, and is the G20 doing enough to encourage innovation, which is so important in the context of the Australian economics position?
Well, I don't think innovation is particularly a role for G20. You know, it's something we're all interested in, but it's within the realm of national governments to take, adopt policies to encourage innovation. And I don't know that it's particularly something that lends itself to the G20 forum. I think in a way a far more interesting test for G20 will be an issue that we haven't discussed, and that is by November, the US Federal Reserve will have will have ceased its bond buying program, and by the middle of next year it will be looking to begin increasing the Fed funds rate, that's the overnight rate. And what it does is dramatise the fact that half of the world's economies, all of them, half of the world's output, all of them rich countries, have 0 interest rates. And as we normalise monetary policy, as we certainly will over the next 3-4 years, first of all in the US and then the UK, but ultimately in Europe and Japan, there will be very dramatic effects on less developed economies, the leaders of which will be coming to Brisbane, particularly concerned to Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, for example, Argentina. This was an issue for the Petersburg Summit, where these leaders of less developed countries were quite concerned about how this transition in monetary policy would be affected. And they'll be very much more concerned by November. And I think one of the things that Australia needs to think about is it's not an issue that can be resolved in November, but as an issue which in my view has to be aired in November. And does Australia have the wit to manage that conversation?
All right, I might just turn to the audience if there are any questions, if you could just raise your hand and we can get some of that conversation moving. Whilst, again, we wait for that, Kerrie, can I ask you, the B20 has said that it wants to see more encouraging tax structures to allow for infrastructure development. I'm just interested in your view as to if there is any local or global tax reform that can effectively help this along.
I always get a little concerned when specific nations implement policies to attract investment, because that potentially leads to the idea of the race to the bottom, or effectively then spillovers. The IMF produced a report 2 months ago now, actually dealing with spillovers, and spillovers are effectively when one country's tax policy has implications for another country's tax situation. So if, say, developing nations start introducing, and they already have tax-free holidays, but start introducing more tax-free holidays, then they're going to end up with less revenue than what they already get. So my preference would certainly be one of cooperation rather than competition, which that model could reflect. So we have cooperation, the countries actually raise the revenue themselves, and then potentially the governments are in the best position to decide how to spend that funding on infrastructure that the country needs.
The evidence, however, would seem to indicate that in fact just the opposite happens, that economies in fact do perhaps not race to the bottom, but in the effort to attract international capital, which is free-flowing in a global environment in which we all reside these days, they look at their internal tax systems and look at ways in which then by lowering various tax rates that will be an attractor. I give two examples. I think the media this morning was talking about a decision by CSL to invest $500 million in a new company or a new factory in Germany, or was it Switzerland? Switzerland, I think. Why? Wasn't so much that the tax rates and so on were all that different per se, but it was because the company tax rates in Australia were so much higher and a disincentive, but the opportunity for innovation and a government that was committed to innovation, which picks up your comment about innovation a little earlier, was clearly there. And yet here is a mainstay of Australian high-end value-added manufacturing, which CEDA's report back in April of this year touched on, looking overseas and being impacted on by tax rates in a sense. The other issue, of course, goes to just where our corporate tax rate is. And again, work that CEDA has done and which other economists have remarked on, is that if you're wanting to stimulate an environment such as this country in terms of being able to attract additional foreign capital, or to have superannuation funds or others invest in infrastructure projects, then our corporate tax rate has to be lowered. Now, the government in the last budget, I think, dropped it 1%. In the same token, the UK government had decided to drop it to about 22%, almost in the same time frame. And the OECD average is 25%. So we're still a long way away. And if G20 is serious about looking at some of the fundamental economic issues associated with a taxation regime, and Kerrie's dead right, I mean, internationally looking at it, then these are the sorts of the basic things that I think governments need to concentrate their efforts on. Because ultimately, it will be tax rates, it will be attractors to foreign nationals investing in other countries, or, in the case of CSL, deciding to invest somewhere else, albeit there was something else, and that was around innovation, which in turn goes to government policy about support for innovation in a country like Australia.
Thanks, Stephen. Got a question down here.
Yeah, Colin Scobie from Central Data Networks. John, I was just interested in New Zealand. They've made significant progress, have they not, in the banking sector towards some sort of reform. Is that a sort of a country that we could follow, perhaps, for that particular reform?
Well, so far as I know, New Zealand is on a par with us in the adoption of reforms. In fact, in a way, the reforms have been adopted so readily, so widely, that it almost raises a question mark. For example, China has also adopted all these reforms. And yet you would probably say that the risk of a financial crisis coming out of China is higher than the risk of a financial crisis coming out of New Zealand, for example, so that the nature of your regulatory structure is only the kind of first step in figuring things out. But of course, as you know, essentially, the New Zealand financial system is a unit of the Australian financial system. And ultimately, whatever New Zealand's rules are, they rely on our rules because they're Australian banks. And if they have a problem, we have a problem, and vice versa.
I think we've got time for one more question. Anything? In which case I'm going to assume the liberty and ask that final question again. But is it, to all the panellists, is it too easy to be negative about the G20? And I think, John, you addressed this slightly in your talk, and you certainly do in the paper, but don't we have to ask ourselves, what would we be now if we didn't have it, or didn't have that in the crisis that we had with the GFC? And should we not constantly be trying to find the solution?
Well, I certainly think so. I don't think we have an alternative. We can't go back to the G7. That's something we've discarded as not including the nations which, as Kerrie rightly said, are now so important to China, Brazil and so forth. We can't go back there. We wouldn't want a global government institution that's much bigger than the G20. And having elevated to summits, I think it's serving a real purpose. And to my mind, actually, whilst it's certainly the case that more might have been achieved and more probably will be achieved, more needs to be done, G20 has been the umbrella for quite a lot of progress on global financial reform.
Kerrie?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with John. I certainly don't want to sound negative at all towards the work that the G20 has already done, particularly in the tax space, because I think that they're producing some really good work. It's fantastic that they're working with the OECD. The OECD are also doing some fantastic work. It's a case of taking it to that next step. So the points that I raised when I spoke were really about that. I think we're coming from a really solid base with the work that G20 has already done in tax reform. And it's starting to make governments accountable too. And you may have seen one of my concerns is the fact with the automatic exchange of information. It was agreed to in principle by the G20 in February. Unfortunately, Australia isn't one of the early adopters. That's actually really disappointing, but hopefully because that information gets out there, we may in fact keep the ball rolling.
Look, my quick comment would be, the proof will be subsequent to the actual meeting and the outcomes which were announced in a communique. If governments then go away, having agreed to a specific set of actions they're going to implement, if they implement them, huge tick. On the other hand, if it's just a statement of aspirations, then there will be arguments about the effectiveness of it. I think both John and Kerrie have argued not only today, but very clearly in our report, that there have been substantial successes from previous G20 meetings. I see no reason why that won't happen again, but we will also be in a position to judge effectively how governments around the globe implement those decisions. And here in Australia, of course, we will have a very interested eye on what comes as a result of those broader discussions.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you also, Kerrie, and thank you, John, as well. Can I now ask Professor Ken Wiltshire, AO, to do the formal vote of thanks? Thanks very much.